I have a question for you.
Please.
What's your interest in Viennese tuning and ancient stuff? You're a modern bass player. You come from El Sistema. You're a fantastic bass player. He's a fantastic bass player, really. I played a concert with him last week. He's amazing. So you're an amazing modern bass player. You come from a system where they produce incredible musicians on modern instruments. What's the Viennese tuning and the ancient music? What's your thing there? What is it that fascinates you in this world?
Well, I started experimenting with Viennese tuning because I couldn't believe that the concerts were supposed to be so difficult and sound so bad, like the titles of concert. It's extremely and stupidly difficult.
But I have news for you. In Viennese tuning, it's difficult too.
But it's more but it's more rewarding. It's
that's true. That's true.
At the end, I discovered that it's not easier. It just makes sense.
Yes. That's true. A lot of the Viennese repertoire, it seems like it's easier in the Viennese tuning, but it's not always really easier. It just sounds better. But it's not really like some of the passages in Dittersdorf, the one they cut in the modern version.
That's why
it's not really easier in Viennese tuning. It's not.
But
really
I was thinking, why do we have a concert that you have to cut 30 bars out of it? Why do you play a concert and it's a staple of the repertoire that you have to modify so much? So I wanted to know what the real thing was supposed to be. So I started experimenting, and it was actually fun. And then I discovered that they weren't just mean people trying to write something impossible to play for bass players, but that we were trying to play a translation of something. And when I have the opportunity, I like to go to the original sources and see what it is about. But I play the modern bass, and I wanted to ask you about this. For me, Viennese tuning is something I experiment on to bring what I learned to the modern instrument. Yes, of course, I like playing with God strings, but I like playing with God strings and old bows because I like seeing the limitations and what you can and cannot do with them. So how do you do what do you bring from the Viennese bass to the modern bass, from the gut to the steel, from the ancient bows to the modern bow?
A feeling of let's say precision in feedback from the instrument. It's much more delicate. Playing on gut strings, playing with these ancient bows, with, like you said, their limitations, but we see them from our modern side, we see those as limitations, but actually I don't see that as limitations. I see them as challenges to grow, as challenges to become a better musician. They're not as much limitations to me. The fact that the gut string reacts differently, that these ancient bows with their strange with their strange curves, they react differently, and up bow and down bow is different, and so you have to learn how to manage this set of differences from the modern instrument, and this develops a certain feeling, and you're attentive to feedback from your tools, from the material. The instrument tells you so much. The instrument gives you feedback constantly. And if you're attentive to it, if you want to listen to what the instrument and the bow and the strings, what they tell you, then you develop as a musician. And this development doesn't stop when you go back to the modern instrument. It just continues. And you play with the same fine feeling that you've developed on the gut instrument, and you do the same thing on the modern instrument. That's why I said in the beginning, you can make a modern instrument sound like an ancient instrument. Once you've discovered this feeling, this physical feeling of how things react, you can easily translate that to a modern instrument. That's why some modern violin players, for instance, they play on the modern violin, and when you listen to them, you think they're playing on a Baroque violin. Some of them can do it. And maybe they haven't even played on a gut instrument, I don't know. But it's a question of opening your mind and opening your physical... I'm doing this all the time because that's what it is. It's just this feeling of... It's so much more tactile.
Well, one thing that you learn when playing with frets and guts is that your left hand doesn't have to be so active because that doesn't translate to the sound. If you're vibrating so much behind the fret and being very active with the left hand is not the same as with the steel.
No, it's not the same. On the other hand, when you consciously try to vibrate less, I'm not saying not to vibrate, but in the beginning you have to do this, try not to vibrate. It's very difficult to do when you're used to it. It's automatic. Then you're obliged to find expression in some other way because you want to express something. That's music. The music talks to us. We're musicians. We want to express what the music tells us in some way. And we can't do it here. So we have to do it with the right hand. And then it becomes really interesting instead of just stupidly going down, up, with the same uniform sound which we've learned since the Romantic period to have the same sound, down bow and up bow, and should be the same. And preferably don't hear the difference, don't hear the change, which is total nonsense. In ancient music, the more you hear the difference, the better. Not always, but in some way you have to exploit the differences because some of these old bows really do sound different, down bow, up bow. You have this duality which you have in a lot of, in ancient philosophy you have, which is politically incorrect now, but you have male and female, and you have yin and yang, and you have good and bad, getting dangerous now. Nobilis, vilis, for instance, the symbols for down bow and up bow. The V, and this actually is an N, noble, vile. Se non è vero è ben trovato, I don't know if it's true, but it gives an indication of what it's about. You have the noble down bow and the vile up bow. So you have the good bow and the bad bow. You have the black and the white, no, the white and the black. You have female, male, dangerous. So you have all these sensitivity, all these little things that develop your personality, your musical personality. So you have to get expression in the bow. So instead of making a sound like this, maybe you have a sound like this, or a sound that goes, a sound that changes. And when you read all treatises, for instance, you have the idea of a Tonkopf, the head, the beginning, the start of the note. That's one of those things, everything's connected. We see a long note, we talked about long notes before. You see a long note, 4 beats, and we play ba, 4 beats. In ancient music, generalizing, this doesn't happen all that often, because with the start of the note, with the accent or with the way you start a note, you can suggest if it's going to be a long note or a short note. So once you have the suggestion, this is going to be a long note, you don't have to play the note anymore. You just play the beginning of the note and you just let it resonate, and it sounds like a long note because the listener knows, this attack means a long note. We don't need to feed the note for 4 beats. So this sensibility, this quality, this attentiveness to how you play, this you transpose to the modern instrument, and it's like a new world. It's a new way of playing even on the modern instrument. You get so much more in shades, in colors, in possibilities to shape the sound. You have a strong attack, that's a short note. You have a softer attack, that's a long note. You don't need to really... So this makes for a wholly different way of playing. So these things you can translate to the modern instrument, and you can play this way on a modern bass as well. So the modern bass starts to sound like an ancient instrument.
You just have to know what you want, and you have to search for it in the ancient instruments.
Of course, and for a different type of music, romantic music, you're probably going to need a more singing sound, more sustained sound. Of course, it's a different aesthetic. But even then, you can introduce some of these elements of the ancient music into the romantic music. Because don't forget, we live in the 21st century. And when we play romantic and classical and Baroque music, we start from here. We go back with all the baggage that we have here. And I think it's a better idea to try. We can't always succeed, but to try to jump back 300 years and to see music coming from here. That means that Baroque music, because Baroque, classical, romantic, those are modern terms. People back then didn't know they were Baroque, and they didn't know they were classical, and they didn't know they were romantic. We invented these terms. Mozart would have called himself a romantic composer, not a classical composer.
Yes.
So, but all these elements from ancient, older music, they infiltrate into the next music. It's not like a clear-cut distinction. So, all these elements are still there. In romantic music, you still have some of the classical things, and in Baroque, you still have some. In classical, you have some of the Baroque, etc. And if you jump from the 21st century and you go backwards, you don't have these things. You start with your luggage from here, with the ideas you have about music now, and we transpose that to ancient music. So I think it's better to go back if you can. Try to imagine that you come from there and see the chronological evolution of music. And then you can introduce these elements, even the instrument elements you learned in Baroque and classical. They're still somewhere there in the romantic music. It goes slowly, these changes. And that's what makes it so enriching to go back to Baroque and even earlier music, to go to the Viola da Gamba and the Violone, and then go to the bass and see how everything still has traces of what went before. There's still traces there.
And one thing I find very interesting is that modern instrument building it's very good. The level is very high right now, so you have almost maybe limitless instruments. Our strings can do everything and our bows can do everything. So when you have all these possibilities and you face a blank score like the Vanhal concerto, or that you have so many things to put in, then you have so many possibilities. But when you go back, that you don't have all these possibilities, then the paths are maybe clearer than if you would face that with the modern instrument. So what I gain is some insights of what can be done with this music. This music has this set of notes. They have a way of being played because the instruments, they have limitations. They cannot do everything.
Mm-hmm.
So by going backwards, you find the information about articulation, which is not written. It's just because the instrument cannot do everything. And you find about dynamics, which are most of the time not written in the scores. There is no mezzo forte or mezzo piano written in the classical period, which doesn't mean they didn't play mezzo forte, mezzo piano. And yes, you find a variety of sounds and possibilities that I find fascinating.
Yes.
So
but that's
limiting yourself, you can discover so much about what is not written in the score.
Yeah, but that's very interesting you mentioned that, because back in school, music school, we learned in Baroque music you have this, what we call terrace dynamics. You have piano and you have forte. And because there's nothing written in between, it didn't exist, which I think is nonsense. It's not because something's not written that it wasn't done. Because if you believe that, then almost nothing was done in ancient music, because there's almost nothing written. So, of course, you have to go back to the information you can find and also use some common sense. So not just read what's on the paper and believe what's on the paper. You have piano and you have forte, and that's it. I don't think so. There's always been a whole magnitude, a whole lot of shades of possibilities in between. The possibilities are limited, but still within the limited possibilities, there are a lot of, let's call them micro possibilities, if you understand what I mean. Within the limitations, it's like a microscope. You find new possibilities within the limits. That's what I find so fascinating about ancient music. Okay, you can say it's limited and the bow doesn't do this and that, but within these limits, you find smaller possibilities.
Yes.
So it's endless. It's an endless source of inspiration, even with the limits. Yeah, that's a nice remark. Yeah.
Would you like to talk about the composers, performers?
Yes.
Repertoire maybe in this Viennese period.
Viennese, let's distinguish between Viennese bass in ensemble music and Viennese bass in solo and solo chamber music, let's say duets, trios, etc. So my focus is on the solo role of the bass. And then, of course, the Viennese period was a very special period in the history of the bass, because suddenly for 50 or 60 years you have an explosion of virtuosity and of something amazing which we haven't seen before and which we won't see after until Bottesini and Dragonetti or until the 20th century. But apart from that, this is like an island in history, like what's going on there? Suddenly you have these virtuosity, these virtuoso players and this virtuoso literature. On the other hand, of course, you have to know that from the 30-odd concerti we know, 18 were by one composer.
Performer,
composer. So that kind of puts a relative slant on the thing. It's not like it was all over the place. Of course, there were, like I said, it was an explosion of virtuosity, but let's keep this in perspective. It's not like everybody and the man in the street knew what a solo double bass was. Okay, so 18 of the concerti were Spergers. Then you have 2 by Dittersdorf, and then you have Hofmeister, with also chamber music quartets, etc. There was quite some literature. So the most important figure, I would say, is Sperger, at least quantitatively, in the number of number of pieces he wrote. Dittersdorf, because he was in the early generation, and we shouldn't forget Dittersdorf was a very famous composer in his time. He was probably more famous than some of the big names that we venerate today. And again, like I said about Quantz, people go to Quantz's treatise to read about their instrument. I don't read the rest. From Dittersdorf's autobiography, we know the little thing he said about Pichelberger, his bass player, and that's all we know. But when you read the whole autobiography by Dittersdorf, it's a fascinating book. You can't put it down. I read it, I took it to bed, and I had to finish it because it's so interesting, so fascinating. There's so much information there which you can use in your bass playing as well. So don't always focus on bass playing. You can learn a lot more from non-bass players than you can from bass players, and it's a bass player who's telling you. So you have Dittersdorf, then you have Hofmeister. Hofmeister is a very special case in this way that some of his music is very similar to Sperger's. Even sometimes you have there's literally the same passages in Sperger and in Hofmeister. So who copied from whom, we don't know. Did he take it from Sperger, or did Sperger take it from Hofmeister, or did they find the same things by coincidence? I don't know, but that's really interesting. Pichelberger, he didn't write anything, he didn't compose anything, I think, but he's an interesting figure because he belongs to the first generation and to the second generation at the same time. Well, not at the same time, obviously, at a different time. But he was the bass player for whom Dittersdorf wrote his concerti, and then so many years later, Mozart wrote his Per questa bella mano for Pichelberger. So that's interesting to have this connection between 2 generations with the same figure, playing 2 times a very important role for the first couple of bass concertos and then for the greatest composer of the period, for Mozart, who wrote this Per questa bella mano for him. So it's very interesting. It's also interesting to see that in Mozart's Per questa, actually, he's very conservative in the techniques, in the let's say in the demands he places on the player. It's not that much more difficult than Dittersdorf. It's a bit more complicated maybe for the bow, except for the passage in the second concerto. So actually Mozart was not really very progressive in his way of writing for the double bass. Maybe because Pichelberger was an old man by then, or to our standards, and maybe he wasn't the most fantastic bass player. He was not Sperger. So that's interesting to compare these things. Apart from that, you have Kempfer, about whom we know very little. Some people think that the Vanhal Concerto was written for him and not for Sperger. We don't know. There's a lot of things we don't know. There's more we don't know than we do know. Generally, we assume it was for Sperger. So that's the general...
Because we know the manuscripts
Because the manuscripts come from Sperger's collection, and actually most of the whole repertoire of Viennese solo double bass comes from Sperger's collection. If Sperger hadn't collected all these works, we wouldn't have Vanhal Concerto, we wouldn't have Dittersdorf, we wouldn't have Hofmeister, we wouldn't have anything. There would be a couple of pieces, curiosities, we wouldn't have known what happened there. We would have no idea.
Thanks, Sperger.
Thank you, Sperger. So, we have to make a conclusion, and thank you very much, José Andrés, for joining me today.
Thank you very
for
much,
asking
Korneel, for
intelligent
all these
questions.
insights on the Viennese bass.
And just to remind you, this is just a little introduction to just a little introduction to the Vanhal videos, because once you get me started, I just can't stop. It's a lifelong passion, and I'm fascinated by this instrument, and yeah, once I start talking, this could be a very, very long video. But we'll
But you
finish.
have a book on the subject.
That's
as well.
right. There's a book coming out. It's almost finished. It's going to be 500 pages, more or less. I'm still writing, so maybe it's going to be 600. But the book is it will be published early in 2019. It's going to be on the Viennese tuning website, which I'm starting. But you'll get all the information in due time. It's a long book about the history, about technique. It includes a method for the solo Viennese double bass. And it's called Metahodos, which is ancient Greek for method. Thanks again.
Nice.